On the morning of November 1st, 1943, at 0730 hours, Lieutenant General Alexander Vandegrift observed from the bridge of the command ship Macaulay as the coast of Bougainville emerged through the morning mist. Within 2 hours, 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division would land at Empress Augusta Bay. The Japanese maintained 110,000 troops at Rabaul, located 250 miles to the northwest. These forces had been positioned specifically to prevent the operation Vandegrift was about to execute, yet they would not be able to intervene. Vandegrift had previously commanded Marines at Guadalcanal and understood the severe cost of attacking fortified Japanese positions. The island campaigns in the Solomons had resulted in thousands of casualties for objectives that appeared insignificant on maps. 3 weeks later, Tarawa would demonstrate this reality again, with over 3,000 casualties sustained to capture an island merely 2 miles in length. Rabaul was considerably more formidable than Tarawa. The fortress at Rabaul. The Japanese had transformed Rabaul into the most heavily defended position in the South Pacific. After capturing it from a small Australian garrison in February 1942, they spent 20 months developing it into what effectively functioned as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Simpson Harbor possessed the capacity to anchor 100 ships. 5 airfields surrounded the harbor. Lakanai and Vunakanau were pre-war Australian airstrips expanded with concrete runways. Rapopo opened in December 1942 on the coast 14 miles southeast of the town. Tabara was completed in August 1943, halfway between Vunakanau and Rapopo, and Karavat sat on the north coast 13 miles southwest. Together, these airfields featured protective revetments for over 400 aircraft and runways capable of handling Japan's heaviest bombers. The defensive systems included 367 anti-aircraft guns covering every approach to Simpson Harbor and the airfields, 43 coastal defense guns protecting the beaches, and 6,000 machine guns positioned in bunkers and pillboxes. The Japanese army had excavated hundreds of miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock, creating underground barracks for 20,000 men, hospitals capable of treating thousands of wounded, ammunition dumps holding tens of thousands of tons of explosives, and command centers buried so deep that no bomb could reach them. By mid-1943, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were based at Rabaul. The Allied dilemma. The location served as the Pearl Harbor of the South Pacific. Allied planning had consistently identified the capture of Rabaul as the primary objective. Every strategic document since Guadalcanal pointed toward one goal: take Rabaul and control the South Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur characterized it as the key to the theater. Admiral Ernest King identified it as the primary objective for 1943. The combined chiefs of staff approved Operation Cartwheel specifically to encircle and capture Rabaul by March 1944. However, military planners analyzing intelligence estimates identified a significant problem. Taking Rabaul would cost more American lives than any battle since the Civil War. The Japanese had learned from Guadalcanal and every island engagement in 1942. They understood that Americans would arrive with naval gunfire and air superiority, and that Marines would establish beachheads. Consequently, they built defenses designed to transform those advantages into liabilities. The tunnel systems rendered strategic bombing ineffective. The anti-aircraft guns meant air support would be extremely costly to deliver. The garrison size meant achieving numerical superiority would require stripping forces from every other theater. Rabaul's geography offered only 3 possible landing beaches, all narrow and all covered by interlocking fields of fire from positions the Japanese had spent 18 months fortifying. Intelligence analysts estimated an amphibious assault would result in 30% casualties. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison would later write that Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would have appeared insignificant compared to the casualties that would have resulted from an assault on Fortress Rabaul. By mid-1943, planners calculated that 60,000 assault troops would suffer 18,000 killed and wounded, and this assumed optimal conditions. These estimates did not account for Japanese reinforcements from truck, weather delays, or failed naval bombardments. Early attempts to neutralize Rabaul. The first American commander to lose his life in operations against Rabaul was Brigadier General Kenneth Walker. Walker commanded the 5th Air Force Bomber Command under General Kenney. At 44 years old, he was a theorist who believed strategic bombing could win wars without ground invasions. He had taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and written doctrine throughout his career, arguing that air power, properly applied, could destroy any target. Walker flew his first mission over Rabaul in September 1942. The raid accomplished minimal results as Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire drove off the bombers before they could inflict serious damage. However, Walker believed persistence would succeed through repeated attacks to destroy their aircraft on the ground, sink their ships in the harbor, and crater their runways. On January 5, 1943, Walker led a daylight bombing raid on Simpson Harbor with 6 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 6 B-24 Liberators. The plan aimed to strike Japanese transports before they could depart for New Guinea. General Kenney had ordered a dawn raid to avoid Japanese fighters, but Walker delayed it until noon, arguing his bombers needed daylight to form up properly. The 12 bombers attacked at high noon against the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. The Japanese were prepared. Fighters from 3 airfields scrambled to intercept, and anti-aircraft guns opened fire from positions surrounding the entire harbor. Walker's B-17 Flying Fortress, tail number 41-24458, San Antonio Rose, sustained hits almost immediately. He pressed the attack, leading the formation directly through the anti-aircraft fire. His bombardiers scored direct hits on Japanese vessels in the harbor. Then, 15 Japanese fighters engaged the formation. Walker's bomber, already damaged and trailing smoke, could not maneuver effectively. 4 to 5 Zeros concentrated their attack on the lead aircraft. Other crews observed San Antonio Rose losing altitude and heading toward the water, with its number 3 engine smoking. The fighters followed it down into the clouds. Neither Walker, his crew of 10, nor the wreckage was ever recovered. Walker was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, with President Roosevelt presenting it to Walker's son on March 25, 1943. The citation praised his conspicuous leadership and personal valor, but did not mention that the raid had failed to stop the Japanese convoy, or that strategic bombing alone could not neutralize Rabaul. Walker remains the highest-ranking American officer still listed as missing in action from World War II. The second major attempt occurred in October 1943. By then, Allied forces had captured airfields sufficiently close to mount sustained bombing campaigns. General Kenney planned a massive raid for October 12th, involving 349 aircraft, the largest strike ever assembled in the Southwest Pacific, including B-25 Mitchells, B-24 Liberators, P-38 Lightnings, and Australian Beaufighters. The raid struck all 5 airfields simultaneously. Bombardiers reported devastating results, and Kenney's after-action report claimed over 100 Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground, multiple fuel dumps set ablaze, and runways cratered beyond use. Theater Command sent congratulatory messages, and MacArthur issued press releases declaring Rabaul's air power neutralized. However, these claims were inaccurate. The Japanese engineers repaired the runways within 36 hours. Most fuel dumps had been empty as the Japanese had moved supplies underground weeks earlier. The aircraft count was significantly exaggerated, with the Japanese having lost fewer than 20 planes, most already damaged and awaiting parts. While the raid appeared impressive in photographs, Rabaul remained fully operational. Kenney attempted another strike on November 2nd. 72 B-25 medium bombers and 80 P-38 fighters attacked Simpson Harbor in a low-level assault, strafing and bombing at minimum altitude. It was the most dangerous mission the 5th Air Force had undertaken in the entire war. The Japanese had reinforced Rabaul just one day before with 173 carrier aircraft and elite.
Among the casualties was Major Raymond Harold Wilkins, commanding officer of the 8th Bombardment Squadron, 3rd Bombardment Group. Wilkins was 33 years old, from San Bernardino, California, and had flown 86 previous combat missions. On his 87th mission over Rabaul, Wilkins led his squadron into Simpson Harbor through intense anti-aircraft fire. His aircraft sustained multiple hits, but he continued his bombing run, destroying a Japanese destroyer and a 9,000-ton transport. His bomber, trailing smoke and losing altitude, could have turned for home. Instead, Wilkins made a strafing run on a heavy cruiser to draw fire away from his squadron. His aircraft was shot down and crashed into Simpson Harbor, killing all 6 crew members. Wilkins received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The November 2nd raid cost 19 aircraft and over 60 men killed or missing. In exchange, the Japanese lost 20 aircraft and suffered minor damage to 2 cruisers. The raid had not neutralized Rabaul and had barely affected it. The ground campaign challenges. By mid-November 1943, American commanders were reviewing a year's worth of raids and observing failure, heavy losses, minimal results, and a Japanese base that remained operational regardless of how many times they attacked it. Strategic bombing had not succeeded, not due to lack of courage from aircrews, but because Rabaul was too large, too well defended, and too easily repaired by the Japanese. The ground campaign appeared equally problematic. American and Australian forces had been advancing along the New Guinea coast since January with every mile resulting in casualties. The jungle terrain was more challenging than anything encountered in the Solomons, featuring dense rainforest, steep mountains, disease-carrying mosquitoes, and treacherous swamps. Malaria struck entire battalions. Dengue fever caused temperatures reaching 104 degrees. Dysentery weakened men until they could not walk, and tropical ulcers infected the smallest cuts and spread until flesh rotted. More soldiers were evacuated for disease than for wounds. At Buna and Gona on the northern Papua New Guinea coast in November 1942 through January 1943, Australian and American forces fought for 3 months to clear 2 small coastal villages defended by 6,500 Japanese troops. The Allies committed 13,000 soldiers, with 3,000 becoming casualties and over 7,000 Japanese killed. The fighting was close range, brutal, and desperate. Japanese bunkers constructed from coconut logs absorbed .30 caliber bullets, making flamethrowers the only effective weapon. Men fought hand-to-hand in swamps and jungles, with bodies lying unburied for weeks in tropical heat. The smell of death permeated everything. When Buna finally fell in January 1943, American commanders realized that they had encountered a new form of warfare. The Japanese would not retreat and would not surrender. Every position had to be taken by direct assault against defenders who fought until killed. If Buna cost 3,000 casualties for 2 villages, the cost for Rabaul would be astronomical. At Nassau Bay on the New Guinea coast in late June 1943, American forces from the 41st Infantry Division landed to support Australian operations against Salamoa. The landing was expected to be unopposed as intelligence reported the beach was undefended. However, the intelligence was incorrect. Japanese forces contested the landing. The Americans established a foothold, but spent weeks fighting through jungle and swamps to link up with Australian units. What planners estimated would take days required 6 weeks, with casualties mounting not from major battles, but from constant small unit actions, ambushes, snipers, and disease. At Leh in early September 1943, MacArthur launched his most ambitious operation to date. The 503rd Paratrooper Infantry Regiment jumped onto Mazab Airfield while the Australian 9th Division conducted an amphibious landing at Leh. The operation was perfectly coordinated, with MacArthur himself flying over Mazab to observe the paratroopers jump, standing in the open doorway of a B-17 bomber despite staff protests about the danger. The landing succeeded and the airfield was captured. Australian forces pushed inland, but the Japanese 51st Division defending Leh did not collapse. They conducted a fighting retreat through jungle mountains towards Finschhafen. The Australians pursued, losing men to ambushes and exhaustion. 2 weeks of operations cost the Australians 400 casualties. The Japanese lost over 2,000 killed, but many more escaped to fight elsewhere. Leh was captured, but the enemy army remained intact. This pattern repeated across New Guinea. Finschhafen fell in October after bitter fighting. The Huon Peninsula was cleared by January 1944, but Japanese forces withdrew in good order. Every objective took longer and cost more than estimated. Every Japanese unit fought harder than predicted, and every victory simply moved the front line closer to Rabaul, where 11,000 Japanese troops waited in the strongest defensive position in the Pacific. Allied planners reviewing these campaigns observed mathematics that did not support an assault on Rabaul. If taking a village cost 3,000 casualties and required 3 months, and if capturing an airfield cost 400 casualties and required 2 weeks, then assaulting Rabaul with its 5 airfields, massive garrison, and prepared defenses would result in casualties beyond anything the Allies had suffered. The numbers were unavoidable. The genesis of the bypass strategy did not originate from a single brilliant staff officer working late one night. It evolved from years of strategic thinking that traced back to 1921 when Major Earl Hancock Ellis of the Marine Corps wrote War Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. Ellis had proposed that the United States could defeat Japan by capturing key islands while bypassing others, effectively strangling Japanese garrisons by controlling the sea lanes. The concept had been refined by Admiral Raymond Rogers in War Plan Orange of 1911, but these were theoretical plans for a hypothetical war. In June 1943, as Allied forces fought through the Solomons toward Rabaul, the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in Washington began questioning whether capturing every Japanese base made strategic sense. Their analysis noted that assaulting Rabaul held small promise of reasonable success given the fortress's strength. Committee members argued that if American forces could control the sea and air around Rabaul, the base itself became irrelevant. The key advocate for bypassing Rabaul was General George Catlett Marshall, Army Chief of Staff. Marshall was 62 years old in 1943, a strategic thinker who analyzed the Pacific War in terms of logistics and casualty ratios rather than glory or conquest. He had spent the first 2 years of the war competing for resources against British demands for European priority. Every division sent to the Pacific was a division unavailable for the planned invasion of France. Every ship committed to island fighting was a ship not carrying supplies across the Atlantic. Marshall calculated resources with the precision of an accountant. He reviewed intelligence estimates for Rabaul and analyzed the numbers. Assaulting the fortress would require at minimum 60,000 assault troops, probably closer to 75,000 with support units. Casualties would run 30 to 40% in the first 2 weeks, meaning 20,000 to 30,000 killed and wounded. Replacing those losses would take months, and training their replacements would take even longer. Even if the assault succeeded, Rabaul itself provided no value that justified the cost. It was a base, not a strategic objective. Capturing it accomplished nothing except denying it to Japan, which could be accomplished by isolation. Marshall presented this analysis to the Joint Strategic Survey Committee in June 1943. The committee agreed, and their report noted that assaulting Rabaul held small promise of reasonable success and would seriously delay subsequent operations. They recommended neutralization through air and naval power while advancing through positions that offered less resistance.
However, recommendation was not policy. The Joint Chiefs would have to approve it, and the Joint Chiefs included officers who believed strongly that major enemy positions must be captured, not bypassed.
In the Pacific, General George Churchill Kenney reached the same conclusion from different reasoning. Kenney commanded the 5th Air Force under MacArthur. At 53 years old, he was an innovator who had pioneered skip bombing, low-level strafing attacks, and other tactical developments. After observing his bombers attack Rabaul for months with minimal results, Kenney realized something fundamental. Rabaul could not be destroyed from the air because the base was too large and too dispersed. The Japanese had spread their facilities across hundreds of square miles and buried critical installations in tunnels. They repaired runways within hours. No amount of bombing would eliminate the base. However, Kenney also recognized that destroying Rabaul was unnecessary. It only needed to be neutralized. If Allied forces could build airfields within fighter range of Rabaul, those fighters could sweep over the Japanese base daily. Bombers could crater runways faster than the Japanese could repair them. Fighters could shoot down any transport attempting to land. Submarines and patrol bombers could sink any ship trying to enter Simpson Harbor. The garrison would be trapped, unable to receive supplies, unable to launch aircraft, unable to interfere with Allied operations, defeated without invasion. Kenney presented this concept to MacArthur in July 1943. MacArthur's initial response was negative. He had been planning to capture Rabaul since early 1942. His staff had invested months developing invasion plans. His entire Southwest Pacific strategy pointed toward Rabaul as the culminating objective. Bypassing it felt like retreat and leaving the job unfinished. MacArthur told Kenney the idea had merit, but expressed concerns about operational security, Japanese reinforcement capabilities, and public perception. Kenney persisted. He showed MacArthur projections of what the air campaign could accomplish once Bougainville airfields became operational. He described how submarines could blockade Rabaul and noted that the combined fleet was already withdrawing heavy ships from the base. He argued that time spent assaulting Rabaul was time not spent advancing toward the Philippines, and returning to the Philippines was MacArthur's primary obsession. This argument resonated. By early August, MacArthur had shifted from opposition to reluctant acceptance. He did not endorse bypassing Rabaul enthusiastically. His messages to Washington still emphasized the importance of capturing the base, but he stopped actively fighting the concept and allowed his staff to develop contingency plans for isolation rather than assault. Admiral William Frederick Halsey reached the same conclusion through battlefield experience. Halsey commanded the South Pacific area and had been fighting through the Solomons since taking command in October 1942. He had witnessed Guadalcanal transform into a 6-month ordeal. He had observed good men die on New Georgia, capturing airfields that could have been bypassed. He had lost ships, aircraft, and Marines to diseases that spread through jungle camps. On August 15, 1943, Halsey implemented the first pure bypass operation of the Pacific War. Instead of assaulting the heavily fortified Japanese base on Columbengara in the Central Solomons, he landed troops on lightly defended Vella Villela to the northwest. The operation succeeded brilliantly. American forces built an airfield on Vella Villela, while the Japanese garrison on Columbengara remained isolated and irrelevant. 6 weeks later, the Japanese evacuated Columbengara without American forces firing a shot at the base itself. Halsey had proven the concept worked. The Quebec Conference Decision. In August 1943, the combined chiefs of staff met in Quebec for the Quadrant Conference. The gathering brought together American and British military leadership to coordinate strategy across all theaters.
The question of what to do about Rabaul dominated Pacific discussions. Prime Minister Churchill attended with his chiefs of staff. President Franklin Roosevelt brought Marshal King and General Henry Arnold of the Army Air Forces. The conference lasted from August 17th through August 24th. Marshall presented the case for bypassing Rabaul on August 19th. He had prepared meticulously, bringing maps showing Rabaul's defenses, intelligence estimates of garrison strength, casualty projections for amphibious assault, and alternative plans for isolating the base. His presentation was methodical, logical, and compelling. He argued that assaulting Rabaul would cost more American casualties than the Allies could afford, while achieving no strategic advantage that could not be gained by isolation. The fortress controlled no essential territory and threatened no vital installations. It existed as a threat only if allowed to operate. Deny it the ability to operate, and it became irrelevant. Marshall pressed his advantage. The British chiefs of staff sided with Marshall. They were fighting in Burma, facing their own resource limitations and watching casualties mount in Italy. They had no interest in seeing American resources consumed in a battle that achieved nothing except denying Japan a base that could be denied through isolation. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, noted pointedly that the Americans seemed capable of losing men taking islands, but less capable of advancing toward strategic objectives. It would be better to bypass the fortress and keep moving.
On August 24, 1943, the combined chiefs issued their directive. Rabaul would be neutralized by air and naval action, but not captured. Allied forces would seize positions on Bougainville, the Green Islands, and the Admiralty Islands to establish airfields within range. These airfields would maintain pressure on Rabaul, prevent reinforcement, interdict supply, and contain the garrison. The fortress would be left to deteriorate. MacArthur would redirect forces planned for the Rabaul invasion toward operations in western New Guinea and eventually the Philippines. Halsey would continue advancing through the Solomons, but avoid costly assaults on heavily defended positions. Implementation of the bypass. The formal directive reached MacArthur's headquarters in Brisbane on September 17th. MacArthur read it in his office overlooking the Brisbane River, while his staff waited for his reaction. They had spent over a year planning to capture Rabaul. Maps covered the walls showing landing beaches, phase lines, and objectives. Intelligence files detailed Japanese defenses. Logistics plans calculated shipping requirements. Training programs prepared assault units. All of it was now obsolete. MacArthur sat silent for a few minutes. Then he summoned his chief of staff, Major General Richard Sutherland, and instructed him to begin replanning. The objective was no longer Rabaul, but the Philippines. Rabaul would be bypassed. Forces designated for the assault would be redirected to operations at Hollandia and Aitape in New Guinea. The schedule would accelerate, allowing them to reach the Philippines months earlier than previously planned. Years later, MacArthur would claim in his memoirs that bypassing strongpoints had always been his strategy, that he had pioneered the concept, and that the Joint Chiefs had simply confirmed his tactical genius. The historical record shows otherwise. MacArthur opposed the bypass until the Joint Chiefs ordered it. However, MacArthur was intelligent enough to recognize when he had lost an argument and pragmatic enough to transform defeat into advantage. If the Joint Chiefs wanted bypass operations, MacArthur would execute bypass operations on a scale never imagined. He would leapfrog across New Guinea, leaving entire Japanese armies isolated and irrelevant. The Philippines became his obsession, and Rabaul became a footnote. Proving the strategy.
What occurred in the subsequent 6 months demonstrated that the bypass strategy worked better than anyone expected. The test began on November 1st, 1943, when 14,000 Marines of the 3rd Marine Division landed at Empress Augusta Bay on Bougainville, under Lieutenant Governor Vandegrift's command. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul attempted to interfere by dispatching a cruiser force from Truk to attack the landing. Admiral Halsey responded by ordering carrier strikes on Rabaul itself. On November 5th, Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman commanded Task Force 38, built around the carriers Saratoga and Princeton. Sherman was 58 years old, a naval aviator who had been flying since 1917. He understood the risks of sending carriers against a land-based fortress. Rabaul had over 300 anti-aircraft guns and could launch hundreds of fighters. However, Halsey's orders were clear: strike the Japanese fleet before it could reach Bougainville. At dawn on November 5th, Sherman launched 97 aircraft from his 2 carriers, 71 from Saratoga and 26 from Princeton. The strike package included Dauntless dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Hellcat fighters. They flew 250 miles to Rabaul, arrived over Simpson Harbor at first light, and caught the Japanese cruiser force at anchor. The attack lasted 18 minutes. American dive bombers descended through anti-aircraft fire and placed bombs on 6 of the 7 heavy cruisers in the harbor. Otago was struck by near misses that killed 22 crewmen, including her captain. Maya took a bomb in her engine room that killed 70. Mogami was set ablaze with 19 dead. Takao suffered 2 bomb hits and 23 killed. Chikuma and the light cruiser Agano were damaged. By the time the American aircraft turned for home, the Japanese cruiser force was crippled. Sherman lost 9 aircraft and 14 airmen. Naval historians would characterize it as Pearl Harbor in reverse. The first successful carrier strike against a heavily defended land base. 1 hour after the carrier strike, 27 B-24 Liberators from General Kenney's 5th Air Force attacked Simpson Harbor with 58 P-38 Lightning escorts, adding to the damage. By the end of November 5th, the Japanese combined fleet had learned that Simpson Harbor was not safe. The cruisers limped back to Truk. The Japanese Navy never sent another heavy surface ship to Rabaul. Without naval support, the Rabaul garrison could not contest the Bougainville landing. The Marines established their beachhead without opposition. Within 3 weeks, the Marines had constructed an airfield on Bougainville. On November 9th, Major General Roy Geiger arrived to take command of 1st Marine Amphibious Corps, relieving Vandegrift. Geiger was 58 years old, one of the Marine Corps' pioneer aviators who had been flying since 1917. He understood how air power could dominate a battlefield. Under his command, the Bougainville airfield became operational in early December. American bombers immediately began striking Rabaul from 250 miles away. The second test came in late December, when Marines landed at Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain. The operation secured the strait between New Britain and New Guinea, opening sea lanes for Allied shipping. The Japanese garrison at Rabaul attempted to reinforce Cape Gloucester. American submarines sank 2 of the 3 troop transports before they arrived, and the 3rd turned back. The Cape Gloucester landing succeeded with minimal casualties. By January 1944, Rabaul was surrounded. Allied airfields on Bougainville, New Britain, and the Green Islands maintained constant pressure on the base. Fighters swept over Rabaul daily, shooting down any Japanese aircraft that attempted to take off. Bombers cratered the runways every night. The Japanese could repair them, but could not use them. Simpson Harbor became a graveyard of sunken ships. Supply convoys stopped attempting to reach the base. The 110,000 troops were isolated. The Strategic Revolution. Other American commanders observed what happened at Rabaul and recognized the strategic implications. Admiral Nimitz, commanding the Central Pacific area, witnessed the bypass succeed and applied it to the Marshall Islands. Instead of attacking heavily fortified bases at Watch, Malaloape, and Mili, he bypassed them entirely and captured lightly defended Kwajalein and Aniwet. Bypassed garrisons were isolated and unable to interfere. MacArthur employed the same strategy in New Guinea, bypassing Japanese concentrations at Madong and Wewak and landing at Hollandia, hundreds of miles to the west. The Japanese 18th Army found themselves surrounded by Allied airfields with no means to counterattack. By March 1944, the bypass strategy had spread across the Pacific theater. Planners no longer assumed every enemy position required capture. They asked different questions. Can we circumvent it? Can we isolate it? Can we achieve objectives without fighting for this ground? The answer, increasingly, was affirmative. Statistics revealed the effectiveness. In the 12 months before the Rabaul bypass, Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific suffered over 15,000 casualties, capturing positions that provided minimal strategic value. In the 12 months after, casualties dropped below 8,000, while the rate of advance more than doubled. Forces moved faster, lost fewer men, and achieved superior results. The character of the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. The Japanese perspective. For the Japanese, realization came gradually, then comprehensively. The first indication that something had changed came in late November 1943, when the Rabaul garrison reported American forces had landed on Bougainville but were not advancing toward Rabaul. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo assumed it was a diversion, with the real attack to come later. They ordered the garrison to prepare for invasion. The invasion never materialized.
December passed, January passed. Americans continued building airfields and bombing Rabaul, but never landed troops. By February 1944, Japanese commanders understood they were being bypassed. 110,000 troops, the largest concentration of Japanese forces in the South Pacific, occupied a fortress the enemy had decided not to attack. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka commanded the Southeast Area Fleet at Rabaul. He was 52 years old, a career naval officer who had overseen construction of the airfields, tunnels, and defenses. He had prepared for the decisive battle when American Marines would storm the beaches and the garrison would fight to the last man. He had never prepared for being ignored. Kusaka's initial reaction was confusion. Why bypass such a strategic position? Rabaul controlled sea lanes and threatened any Allied advance. Leaving it intact appeared to be a critical error. He waited for the invasion he knew had to come. However, as weeks turned to months, and the only Americans he encountered were bomber crews at 20,000 feet, confusion transformed into understanding. The Americans did not need to capture Rabaul. They had already defeated it. Without ships, Rabaul could not project power. Without aircraft, the airfields were useless. Without supplies, the garrison could not survive indefinitely. Kusaka ordered troops to plant gardens, grow their own food, and prepare for a siege that might last years. He understood the war was lost for Rabaul the moment the last supply convoy turned back in January 1944. Everything after that was simply waiting. Other Japanese garrisons observed Rabaul and felt their strategic position collapse. At Truk, the main fleet base in the Caroline Islands, commanders realized if Americans could bypass Rabaul, they could bypass Truk. They began evacuating the fleet westward. At Wewak, in New Guinea, the 18th Army occupied fortified positions, waiting for attacks that never came, while Americans landed 400 miles behind them in Hollandia.
At Kavieng on New Ireland, the garrison fortified their positions and watched American ships sail past toward other targets. The psychological impact was devastating. For 2 years, Japanese strategy had relied on defending key positions, hold islands, control sea lanes, and make every American advance so costly they would negotiate peace. The bypass strategy destroyed that logic. It did not matter how well a position was fortified if the enemy circumvented it. It did not matter how many troops were concentrated if those troops could not maneuver. The defensive perimeter Japan had spent 2 years building was revealed as an illusion. Japanese pilots reported American tactics changing. American ships appeared in locations they should not reach. Bombers struck targets that should be out of range. Marines landed on islands that should be isolated. Americans moved faster than Japanese forces could respond because the Japanese fleet was too damaged, aircraft too few, and supply lines too vulnerable. By mid-1944, Japan had lost strategic mobility. They could defend positions they held, but could not counterattack, could not reinforce threatened areas, and could not evacuate troops from bypassed garrisons. Americans controlled sea and air, which meant Americans controlled the pace and direction of the war. The reversal was complete. In early 1943, Japanese commanders believed Rabaul was the key to holding the Southwest Pacific. By late 1944, Rabaul was a prison, 110,000 troops occupying tunnels, growing vegetables in volcanic soil, waiting for relief that would never arrive. Americans defeated Rabaul without firing a shot at it on the ground. They accomplished this by rendering it irrelevant. The aftermath and legacy. The bypass strategy received no formal recognition during the war. There was no ceremony celebrating the decision not to invade Rabaul. No medals were awarded for saving 20,000 lives by choosing not to fight. The Joint Chiefs issued a directive. Commanders implemented it. The war continued.